Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A real pleasure of mine to connect back with an old friend of mine, Rick Anderson, who is one of Canada's top political commentators. He's a principal of Earnscliffe. He is a long-term political activist with numerous different parties, best known for the time that he spent advising Preston Manning of the Reform Party. Believe it or not, he was a young liberal at one point in time, and I looked up to him, and we worked together on some issues, and it was really quite a pleasure of mine at that time, and it is today to welcome from London, Rick Anderson. Rick, welcome to our show. How are you, sir?
How are you, Brian? Nice to talk to you.
Excellent. Thanks. So I wanted to connect up with you on a bunch of issues. I understand you're in London because of the upcoming environmental conference. Is that correct?
That's right. My consulting work has tended to focus on energy, which has become energy and the environment, and also energy of the environment and Aboriginal relations, Indigenous relations over the last couple of decades. So this is my first time going to one of those, they call them Council of the Parties, COP. It's the 26th annual, although they skipped last year, conference of the parties, the governments who agreed to climate change, reductions, emission reductions.
And you're going to attend the conference and report back, obviously.
I'm there as a delegate from one of the industry groups, Canadian industry groups that's participating, the Hydrogen Association, which I've been quite involved in, which I am quite involved in. I don't know how many thousands of people are going to be at the conference. I mean, I don't think, I know that everybody's never going to be in the same room at the same time. For the first couple of days, November 1st and 2nd, there's 120 world leaders coming, including the Prime Minister of Canada and Queen Elizabeth and the Pope, to send their messages of support and encouragement to the delegates at the meeting.
Fantastic. Maybe we should chat a little bit further about that hydrogen and alternative energy opportunities for Canada and the environment, et cetera, later on. But let's come back to the federal election. And I wonder, there's a lot of controversy about whether we needed to have it, if anything changed. What do you think? Was it a waste of time, or did anything really get stated with the election results in the end?
Well, I guess I'm 70-30 on the, we didn't need to have it, of course. I mean, legally, it should have been a couple of years later. I understand why the Prime Minister wanted to obtain a majority, although he was really pretty much getting his way in Parliament. And so did he really need that in order to do what he was trying to do? I mean, it wasn't really being thwarted by Parliament. He had good support from both the NDP and the Bloc on most issues, and even the Conservatives on one or two. So he didn't really have trouble in Parliament. So was it necessary? Not legally, not politically, not in terms of parliamentary stalemates and so on. He wanted a majority. He didn't get it. In fact, he forgot pretty much what he had when he went into it. So you can say it's a waste of time and that didn't really accomplish anything. And like I say, I'm about 70% on that interpretation of it. Where the other 30%, I'd say, is the government does have a pretty robust agenda of things it's doing. I mean, first of all, fighting COVID-19 with a whole variety of measures, healthcare measures, travel measures, economic supports, and so on. And we haven't really had, we've not had an election while that was going on. And the government's, of course, also significantly upgraded Canada's climate change policies with the introduction of a new climate plan last December. And it's also advocating a big new social program, which has been advocated before, but not done before, but seems serious this time, in the form of childcare. So those are three big areas where, it doesn't hurt to check the pulse of the Canadian public and see if they're on side with that. And in a sense, the outcome of leaving things as they are suggests that most people are comfortable with the idea, with the general direction of the country and the general policies being followed by the government with the support of some of the parties in Parliament. And so they left things as they were. It was not a change election. It was a kind of leave things as they are election, which in a sense is an affirmation of the direction we're going.
Though at the same time, the Conservative Party won not a majority, but a plurality of the popular vote, one more popular vote than anyone else, which suggests something slightly different than what you're saying. Though that said, I guess the comeback has been that, more people voted for progressive parties. At least some people have said that, you add the NDP, the Green, and the Liberal together, you might get a plurality of popular opinion, or even, frankly, a majority. Where do you come out on those two arguments?
Well, obviously that's true. And for the Prime Minister personally, it's a real challenge. I mean, he got his highest vote percentage of the popular vote in 2015, his first election against, an outgoing prime minister, Stephen Harper. He got a lower percentage of the vote in 2019 and in a lower percentage, fractionally lower, this time around. So that's a bad trend. That's a bad signal. I'm sure he and his people are looking at that very closely and trying to figure out, can they turn that around before the next election? Can they turn it around with him as leader and so on? So he'll be facing those kind of questions within the Liberal Party. But I think the larger point here, Brian, and it's one you and I've talked about before, and I felt strongly about it. Proportional representation is a much better electoral system for Canada. And what we've done then is the first past the post electoral system, which produces the kind of outcome you just described, where the party that comes second in terms of the votes comes first in a number of seats by quite a large margin. That's the first past the post system, and it regularly produces those kinds of exaggerated results. That's why it's called winner take all. But we've become essentially a proportional representation country while not acknowledging it, nor changing any of our electoral rules to accommodate it. We've got 5-6 parties now in Parliament. The argument that people always use, the stick in the muds who resist democratic reform, they always say, "Oh, we don't want PR. We'll end up with too many parties. We'll end up with 5 or 6 parties in Parliament, like the Germans have or the whoever have, and so on." And you kind of go, "Well, yeah, but that's what people are voting for." That's actually why the system needs to reflect that better. And we've got that, and we've got not only that result from our elections already, but we've got the kind of coalition government, the small c coalition, not formal coalitions, that presents, that makes legislatures do. And that's one of the reasons I like PR. It encourages, first of all, more diversity of expression, which I think Canadians are trying to express. That's why we get these results. And it encourages the parties to work together in Parliament or in legislature to get legislation passed, which is what we're also doing. Harper was prime minister for 2 minority periods. They were pretty successful. Trudeau has now been being prime minister for his second minority parliament. And the first one was pretty successful in terms of getting legislation done. So we're actually working together like a PR country does without having a PR system that actually allocates the vote. I mean, the NDP should be getting way more seats than they're getting. So should the Green Party, although they fell below 5% this time. Anyway, you get my point. We're getting these distorted results from our electoral system because we resist the urge to reform it, to make it more proportional, while Canadians are actually going in that direction.
I think during the 2015 election, Justin Trudeau was quoted, I think it was more than 1,000 times or something like this. I heard the number of saying that this will be the last election under the first past the post system. And then they had the commission. But what they were talking about at that point in time, I understood, was something called preferential voting. And that was something that was even more garnered more support than proportional representation. Are you familiar with that system? And does it make any sense? And do you like it versus proportional representation? No, in a word, I hate it. I think it does what we're trying to avoid doing, even more so. What ranked voting does, or preferential voting, is okay, so you're going to waste your vote on this also ran party. So who's your second choice, or who's your third choice? And it forces people to, guess what? Vote for the 2 old parties. Because as you roll those up, you eventually get there, because those are the ones who get more votes than everybody else. And that'd be the Conservatives and Liberals today. So they tend to like that idea because it, kind of discounts your throwaway vote. You can go ahead and, cast your vote for the NDP or the Green Party or the Bloc Québécois, but tell us who you'd really like if it came down just to runoff between the 2 of us, which is kind of what that does. And I think Canadians are voting Green and NDP and Bloc and so on because that's what they want. And I think if you look at it from the other side of the equation, from the leader side of the equation, where leaders are trying to lead these mass parties, theoretically national, theoretically in the old days, I mean, when you and I were young Liberals, they were called brokerage parties, brokerage politics, and they kind of, within the caucus and within the party policymaking system, they homogenized their point of view, so they came up with a national program. We could go back and argue about whether that was really working as well as people thought it was 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, but it mostly did. But today, it's not working that way. And what you see now is leaders constantly struggling, like O'Toole is struggling, like Scheer struggled, with having to represent parties which are quite different coalitions of fiscal and social conservatives. I'm talking about conservatives, obviously now,
Westerners, Easterners, urbanites, rural, and so on, which of course you have to in a democracy do that. The question is whether that's done within a party or within the parliament. And I think we would be better off if we elected people, if social conservatives could elect a certain number of MPs, depending on, how many they vote for and so on, and fiscal conservatives and so on, and people from Quebec and so on. It's kind of crazy that the Bloc Québécois keeps being almost the official opposition because, the winner-take-all system in Quebec exaggerates the result of that party. They get a certain percentage of the vote, which would give them a certain percentage of the seats in that province. But it shouldn't be probably making them a competitor for the official opposition because they actually don't aspire to be the government of the country. So we've got all these things that are kind of not working properly. And to me, a ranked ballot system, a preferential ballot system, if you will, that forces people into the two old line parties is the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be doing what Germany does, and France and Sweden and all these countries who we kind of deride for having PR systems because once in a while, it takes a while to sort things out, but most of the time it doesn't, and they're generally well-run countries.
We're chatting tonight with Rick Anderson, principal of Earnscliffe, a long-term political activist, about number one, his thoughts of the last federal election. Number two, we're going to talk about some of these policies he's spoken about that are going to be the big policies the government is going to be introducing. And then maybe if we have some time, we're going to talk a little bit about the environment and hydrogen. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Rick Anderson. He's a principal of Earnscliffe, a public policy consulting company. He's a political activist. He's one of Canada's best-known political commentators, and I think we've had an interesting conversation already about what's going on in the political sphere in Canada, what happened in the election, which, as Rick said, was not much, but even not much means that people want to continue with what was going on in the last parliament. Rick, we were just chatting about proportional representation versus preferential voting or ranked ballots. You were very supportive of Preston Manning, and one of the arguments that he, voiced a lot was about the Triple E Senate and having elected Senate. Some people have argued that maybe the Senate could be the place that you would have proportional representation, and the House of Commons would stay as first past the post. Where are you coming out on what should happen with the Senate these days, if anywhere?
That's an interesting concept, Brian, and I'm sort of generally supportive of it. I mean, there's two things you have to do there. One is you have to decide that we're going to make the Senate elected as opposed to appointed. That's a big change, but I support that. The second would be that you're going to make it equivalent, on some provincial or regional basis, as opposed to first past the post, constituency-based voting, which I also support. So I kind of like that idea. Those of us who've worked in the trenches of Senate reform are not optimists about that these days. The Supreme Court kind of shut the door on the idea that we can do this incrementally. The American Senate was actually originally appointed as well. And eventually it was appointed by the governors of various states. And eventually they were pushed to hold elections in the states to decide who they should appoint to the Senate. And they got an elected Senate out of that process. And that's what Harper was trying to do, where he asked the Supreme Court, would that be legal in Canada? And they said, no, you'd have to go straight to a constitutional amendment, which of course we know is fraught with problems, because when we patriated the Constitution 40 years ago, we did so without fixing the amending formula so that it's actually workable for changes like the one I'm talking about, which would require everybody to agree. And that's not a sensible way to run it. Unanimity is no way to run a railroad. So I'm not optimistic we can make the constitutional change. If the court is right, it requires constitutional change to do that. But on the point of equivalency, the Triple E Senate that Preston Manning and Reform Party was arguing for in the 1990s, when I was running their campaigns, was equal by province. And of course, there was quite a bit of resistance to that in certain quarters. And myself, as a Quebec-born Ontarian resident, lived 2/3 of my life in Ontario and Quebec, although I'm in Vancouver now in BC, and I've lived in Alberta as well. I was never 100% sure of the 10 equal provinces formula. I know it works well, relatively well in the United States with 50 states, but there's a difference between 10 and 50 in terms of the balance or imbalance of things. The thing I was always struck by, though, is people forget our own constitutional history. The Senate was set up with 5 equal divisions, they called them, of 25 senators. That's how it actually was in the early days. So three maritime provinces had the same number of senators as Quebec had the same number of senators, and eventually we added 4 provinces in the West who had an equal number too. What happened is we added Newfoundland, and the other maritime provinces wouldn't share their allotment with Newfoundland. So Newfoundland had 10 glommed on to the constitutional arrangement. And suddenly the Atlantic provinces, the 4 Atlantic provinces, had both their original division plus 10 more for Newfoundland. So they have more seats than everybody else. And BC started saying, we're not really a region with 3 provinces, prairie provinces. We need our own division, and so on. So we never resolved that, basically, whether it's 10 provinces or 4 regions or 5 regions, and how do you get Newfoundland mixed in with the other maritime provinces and so on. And so it just became a dog's breakfast and we didn't do it, but I like that idea.
Let's talk about fragmentation a little bit, if we could. The Reform Party, to a certain extent, was a fragment out of the Conservative Party. In this last election, we heard real support for Maxime Bernier and the PCP, unparalleled support. And I'd like to know whether you think that's going to continue or whether that was a one-time wonder. And frankly, some people talking about this Maverick Party as being a new Reform Party, and that it really could cause a huge amount of impact to the Conservative Party out West. But it didn't seem to in the end. And that was the Social Conservative Party that I thought you spoke about earlier. What do you think about PCP, Maverick, splinter parties, et cetera?
Well, I mean, it goes back to that conversation we were having a few minutes ago about Canadians desiring this more nuanced political expression, and not looking to be necessarily part of supporting a party which homogenizes everybody's point of view into a majoritarian kind of approach to things. So I think we have to pay attention to the emergence of these parties. I mean, it's been 50, 60 years since the CCF turned into the NDP and started to become an authentic third party, and now is a contender to, pretty close to the other 2 parties. I mean, 18, 17, 19% versus 32, 33 now for the, it's 2.5 parties at least. But really what we've got is a political system with 2 plus 3 or 2 plus 4 parties in it. And that's a signal to us that we need to pay attention to. I think it's basically healthy. I mean, I know that people will worry about fringe parties and some of the policies or points of view that they advocate, but this is Canada, and this is democracy, and those are views that are out there looking for expression. And the way to resolve that is to debate them in the public arena and in our legislatures rather than suppress them.
You talked about 3 big issues that the government are currently dealing with. And one was, I believe, coming out of COVID-19 or handling COVID-19 coming out of COVID-19. The second was everything to do with the environment. And then the third was childcare. I believe those were the 3 big issues that you talked about. On COVID-19, you and I talked about vaccines at one point in time, and I presume that you're pretty happy with where we are on vaccines. And I'd like to ask you, about mandates and how stringent we should get on people that are unvaccinated and don't want vaccines. But I'd also like to ask you about guaranteed annual income. When you and I were young Liberals, guaranteed annual income was one of the things that people talked about. And we've really had a test market sort of with guaranteed annual income with the different government programs in this past year. Where do you come out on sort of what we've got to do to end this COVID-19, both from a vaccine standpoint as well as a economic standpoint?
Well, there was a lot of things in that one question, Brian. Have we got an hour? First of all, yes, I'm happy about how quickly vaccines have emerged, effective vaccines have emerged. I'm not as happy as our political establishment became and our populace became. We were doing extremely well April, May, June, and getting towards higher and higher levels of vaccination. But we got to a point, I remember in mid-June, because I was tracking these things pretty closely, We, started competing with the biggest countries in the world in terms of the rate of vaccination. And we're third or fourth in the G7, and second and third, and then we finally became the fastest pace of vaccinations in the G7. I think that's a real tribute to the public servants and the politicians who were involved in that. I know this is a controversial topic and so on, and people think we should have finished that in April instead of June. But I thought that that we did a very good job, given the hand that we were dealt. But we quit. We gave ourselves so big a pat in the back there around Canada Day that we actually slowed it down. In June, we were doing 500,000 vaccinations a day. By the end of July, it had fallen to about 150. And we still had another 10 or 15 points to go. And I don't mean to get to 100%, because you're never going to get to that, but to at least higher percentages. And it's taken us a long time. Now we're talking about 85% of our eligible population. Finally, it's taken us since Canada Day till now to close that last 5 points. And that was a mistake that we kind of took our foot off the gas back there in July, because I guess politicians and governments are fatigued like everybody else with the pandemic. And it felt good to say, to recognize that we're amongst the world leaders in vaccination, but we forgot that the world leaders were still not near where they needed to be in terms of, herd immunity, as people call it, or community immunity. And we're still not there, which is why we're now looking at extending vaccinations to children. Right now, it's people 12 and above, and I think it's soon in Canada going to become 5 and above, or perhaps 8 and above, but we're going to move in that direction so that we can get closer to something like 80% of the entire population being vaccinated, which is what it will take to really suppress community transmission. And that's important, not because it's some abstraction, but because as long as we allow the disease to keep spreading, and of course we know it's doing that in many parts of the country still, although it's not as dangerous to us as it used to be, because our vaccinations are protecting us from the most severe forms of the disease, but it's still spreading. And that means as long as it's spreading, it's going to keep mutating, and it's going to probably going to find another Delta variant, another Delta type variant that will, as that one did last December, suddenly appear on the horizon. It evolves from, people spreading the disease, and the disease becomes more and more effective at its own transmission. That I'm not a microbiologist, so I, don't just play one once in a while on a radio show. So I'm not pretending I know this stuff, but it's what I'm given to understand from what I read and what I hear from people. That the real risk is that before we get to, community immunity, a higher level of vaccination, basically, we'll get another variant, which is even more severe than Delta, and possibly even one which is better at evading the effectiveness of vaccines. And that would be a shame. That would send us back 6 months or a year in terms of new restrictions and so on, which nobody wants. So that's why it's so important that we keep up with the vaccination campaign. We take boosters if it's just that they're necessary or effective. Get on with the preteen side of it, and use common sense the rest of the time. If you're going indoors into a crowded place, people you don't know, wear a mask. It's not going to kill you, and it might save other people from spreading the disease, because even if you're vaccinated, as I am, you probably are, you can still pick up the virus without getting the disease and pass it on to other people. We need to stop that transmission, or we have the risk of future variants that are even worse than the ones we've seen so far. None of us want that economically. In terms of the economic part of it, I think it's important that we do everything we can to responsibly get back to business as usual. Again, a higher rate of vaccination is part of that. People behaving sensibly is part of that. If you're outdoors doing stuff, go ahead and fill your boots. If you're going to be indoors, take a look. What do you know about the people who are there? Are they vaccinated like you are? Are they not? Don't be afraid or ashamed to wear a mask. I'm over in Europe. I've been here for a few weeks. Masks are being worn in lots of places. I've got one of the apps over here, the Canadian vaccination apps, I'm glad to say, are being well accepted in the UK and on the continent. And people are asking to see them as you go into a bar here in London. It's the first thing you get asked all the time. Can I see your Vax Pass? And takes 30 seconds. You know that that's going to happen before you go in. So you just have it ready on your phone. You show it to them. In France, they actually scan it. Here, they don't. Here in London, they don't. It's a very painless thing. Some people have their hair set on fire at this. And I think if this helps get us through this without having another wave of a more difficult variant, I'm all for it, because it will help us get back to being able to go and see our friends and see our clients and travel like I am, and go to conferences like the one I'm going to, and go out for dinner.
I agree with you and understand. However, my concern is that everything that you apply to Canada, frankly, we have to apply internationally. So that if we don't have, community herd immunity really internationally, the variants are going to mutate, and we're going to end up having something new that's going to come. And as we found out with COVID-19 initially, it can travel from China to Canada or the United States or Italy or wherever fairly quickly because of international travel and trade and everything else. So really what we need to do is have high vaccination rates, community immunity worldwide, not just in Canada. I spoke, Rick, to a microbiologist specialist with Health Canada, and they were saying that vaccines go through 4 stages. And it's well known, and it sort of happens most of the time. The first is voluntary, and that's what we had. Then it was you got to provide incentives, and we had some of those incentives, both Canada and the United States. Then was mandatory, and we talked about how stringent the mandatory has to be and how widespread the mandatory has to be. And this individual said mandatory can be a lot wider and should be a lot wider, because the 4th stage that you go through, which you have to go through because there's a certain number of people that are never going to get vaccinated. That 4th stage is that certain amount of people will never get vaccinated until they personally know someone that dies, and therefore are then motivated to get vaccinated. And what she said was, we want to make that 4th stage as small as possible. We're going to have to hit it, but you want it as small as possible. And so therefore the way to do it is by making that 3rd stage, mandatory stage, far more stringent. Are we doing enough to make vaccine passports? You talked about bars and restaurants. Should we be doing it for schools? Should we be doing it for churches? Should we be doing it for workplaces? Mandating that people have to have the vaccine to be in public.
I don't think we're doing enough on that. And I think that we're having the wrong sort of political debate. I don't think the question is whether we're going to literally force people to have a vaccination. I don't think that's the right question. But I think we should make proof of a vaccination, being asked for proof of your vaccination status, such a commonplace occurrence that it doesn't really occur to people not to be vaccinated. So in France, for instance, which I think is a very good model, they do allow for people to use proof, the health pass in France, as they call it. They do give you 2 ways to get the health pass. One is to be fully vaccinated, 2 doses of vaccine, or to be regularly tested, meaning tested almost every week or so. And if you don't have either one of those conditions, you don't have your Vax Pass no longer, your QR code on your Vax Pass no longer works until you go and either get vaccinated or you get another test. To me, I think that's a good model. It lets people choose a different path if that's what they want to choose, but they're going to have to get tested regularly. And those tests are like $100 a time. And, smart governments don't pay for those when they're trying to offer people a free vaccination. The governments have invested billions in providing. Don't give them free tests. Let them pay for the test if they choose that route. That's what I would favor. And in France, what they've done, which I think is smart, is they've said you don't need the pass for the essential things like to go get groceries and stuff like that. But you do need it to go to a movie, to go to a theater, to go to a sports event, to go to a bar, to go to a cafe, and so on. And those are things that people do every day, and it's a pain in the butt to be tested in order to do them. So people go and get vaccinated. And I think that's a better way of coming at it than some of the discussion we're having in Canada about whether literally everybody has to be forced to be vaccinated. The exception I would make for that are people who work close quarters with senior citizens and with others who are particularly vulnerable to the worst outcomes of the virus. I think if you're working in retirement communities or LTCs or in hospitals probably, or anywhere near ICUs and so on, you should be vaccinated, or you should take a different job with that organization, or maybe in some other organization. But I don't think we should be broadly saying that everybody who works for a railroad or a telecom company, because they're federal jurisdiction, has to be vaccinated. I mean, let people make a choice. And the smart choice is the vaccination, and people will slowly figure that out. A lot of people quickly figured it out. More people will slowly figure it out. And if we make it something they need for things they enjoy doing, like going to hockey games or something like that, a lot more, we'll get a lot closer to that 100%. And I think that's the right way to get there. And I hope that we end up having a less pointed political debate and one which is more effective.
Once we have vaccines approved for kids, what about schools?
Well, we want kids to be in school, although a lot of parents are quite happy homeschooling. And I don't deride that approach if parents are serious about it and capable of doing it. And a lot of people are. I mean, it's not a majority thing or anything like that, but it's not uncommon. If people want to choose that, let them choose it. But I think if you're going to go to a public school, you probably need to be vaccinated unless you've got a doctor saying you can't be for some medical reason or another.
We're chatting with Rick Anderson tonight about COVID-19, about vaccines, about proportional representation, about politics. We're going to take a break and come back with Rick in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Tonight, we're chatting with Rick Anderson. He's a principal with Earnscliffe, a big public affairs strategy consulting company in Canada. He has been probably one of Canada's foremost political commentators over the last couple of decades, a political activist for a couple of decades as well, in a couple of different political parties, best known for his time with Preston Manning and the Reform Party, where he ran some of their campaigns for a while. Rick, you mentioned that you've been very active in the environment and consulting in the environment, and you're actually in London, England, for the upcoming conferences on environmental implementation of actions to meet the Paris Accords. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the issues associated with it in regards to Canada. Is there a future for the oil and gas business in Alberta?
Sure there is. Yes, there is, but not if we do what some people advocate, which is turn our back on the whole business of emissions reduction and the policies that are necessary, the policies and government programs that are necessary to reduce our emissions, our GHG, our greenhouse gas emissions. But if we do that, then I think that the oil and gas sector in Canada has got, the companies that are operating there have got a terrific future. And I think the smart ones understand that. If you look, Google Pathways Group, and you'll see half a dozen of the biggest oil and gas companies in Canada have gotten together to advocate for public policy measures that support emissions reduction, including carbon pricing and clean fuels policy and so on. If I look at what's going on in that debate, and I'm curious that some of the smaller oil companies and some of the ideologues in some think tanks, one or two think tanks, and part of the conservative movement has got itself basically defending buggy whips. And you can't do that. I mean, you need to be always innovating. You also always need to be looking at what markets are looking for. Markets are looking for cleaner fuel. They're looking for conservation. They're looking for fuel efficiency. They're looking for electrification because it's the cleanest fuel of all so far. Smart companies adapt to where markets are going. They don't wait to be pushed there. They get there. The smart ones get there early. Wayne Gretzky used to say, go where the puck's going to be. Don't go where the puck is. The smart energy companies, including in the oil and gas sector, understand that. And they're busy diversifying their portfolio. They're looking at things like hydrogen. They're investing in carbon capture and storage. They're investing in advanced biofuels. They're blending biofuels in with gasoline and diesel and aviation fuel to produce lower emission forms of petroleum products. These are all positive things, not just from an environmental point of view of reducing emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, but from economic opportunities. This technology represents economic opportunities. Mark Carney, the Canadian who used to be the governor of the Bank of Canada and the governor of the Bank of England, is now advising the Prime Minister of Britain Boris Johnson and the Secretary General of the United Nations in advance of this COP26 conference in Glasgow in a couple of weeks. And he's been focusing on bringing private equity, bringing private markets into the emission reduction business. And he's pulled together an alliance, they call it the Glasgow Alliance, of I think it's 100 financial institutions who are managing over $7 trillion in assets. And they've put together a call for action that the investment community get behind investing in emission reduction technologies. Companies that are investing in, investing either directly in those technologies with startup companies, or investing in big companies who are themselves investing in those things. So we're turning something that we saw 20 years ago as a threat into an opportunity, and I think that's really good news. For both our economies, including the energy sector in Canada, and for emission reduction.
You mentioned that you're very involved in hydrogen. Some people think that hydrogen really could be the solution for the oil sands, for the Alberta energy business. Can you explain to us why?
I think it's one of the solutions, Brian. I think that one of the best things that's going on right now in terms of the whole clean tech, clean energy side of things is that we're starting to see multiple paths towards the goal. So if you're an oil company, you've got the path of blending with advanced biofuels to reduce emissions. You've got the path of carbon capture and storage to reduce emissions. You've got the path of diversification. Some of the oil companies, some of the gasoline retailers are putting up electric charging stations right in the plaza of their gas stations. So they're offering, whatever your fuel is, we've got it here. The hydrogen side of it is interesting in a different way. I mean, hydrogen is basically, half of water. You separate hydrogen from oxygen to separate, water from hydrogen from oxygen, which is water. And you do it most cleanly with electrolysis by using electricity to do that. And that gives you green hydrogen as a form of blue hydrogen that's made that still has some emissions associated with it, which is already what we're doing in Canada and have been for some years. And that's a proven technology. The green hydrogen is also a proven technology, but it's more expensive still. So we've got both of those forms of hydrogen that are part of the Canadian approach to hydrogen. Why is hydrogen important? It's a form, you can take electricity, use it to create hydrogen, store hydrogen much more simply than you can store electricity. I mean, to store electricity, you're mostly talking about batteries. And as we know, there's a limit to that, to the portability of that, to the endurance, to the longevity of that, and so on. With hydrogen, you can store it in a liquid or gas form and convert it back into electricity or a fuel, convert it back into a transportation fuel, or into feedstock for petrochemical companies, or you can turn it into a home heating fuel or industrial process fuel. So hydrogen can be used for lots of different ways, not least of which is storage. And the storage thing is particularly important because if you, one of the keys to making our economy cleaner is electrification, as I mentioned. We already have a pretty clean electricity grid in Canada, thanks to all our hydro and thanks to nuclear power as well, which is the second largest form of electricity generation in Canada after hydro. We're now also getting a lot more solar and wind power. So we've got basically 82% of Canada's electricity is generated already without GHG emissions, which is one of the world's highest levels of that. And we're phasing out the last of our coal in the last 4 provinces that have it: Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. That's underway right now. It was mandated 10, 15 years ago, and it's accelerating. So we're going to get to something like 90-something% of our electricity being emissions free. So we've got a good path towards electrification in the country. That means we can use electric energy for home heating, industrial processes, vehicles, and so on. But we can't. It doesn't store as well, and it takes several hours of charging a battery-operated electric vehicle, 3 or 4 hours. There are superchargers that can do it in 20, 25 minutes. Hydrogen refills a vehicle in about the same time as gasoline does. So if you're running a bus fleet, for instance, you don't need to have, for 500 buses, 500 chargers sitting in your depot at night, which is kind of expensive. If you have 250, you're rotating the buses and all that stuff. You want to keep the buses on the road, and you don't want to have that many chargers sitting there. That's infrastructure too. With hydrogen, you can fill them up basically as fast as you could fill them up with diesel. So it's an easier fuel to use. It's more versatile, and hydrogen is the most common element on the planet. So there's a good reason why the existing vertical energy, integrated energy companies are looking closely at hydrogen, because it's so attractive for so many reasons. And if I've got another 30 seconds, I'll tell you the last piece of that.
Please.
On the electrification side, I mentioned nuclear, hydro, wind, and solar for a reason. Those are our primary sources of electricity in Canada, and those are all clean electricity sources. The uptime of nuclear reactors is over 90%. That means you spend billions of dollars building them, and 90% of the time they're operating and producing electricity. Hydro is around 50-something%, hydroelectric dams. And there's a reason why it's not a little bit higher, and I could get into the technology. That's really a public policy reason. Wind is about 35%, and solar is about 20%. Those are averages. You can figure out why solar is 20%. Half the time it's dark, and even on days when it's not dark, there's not that much sun, and so on and so forth. So there's that infrastructure we're building out for solar and wind, but it only produces, let's take wind as an example, 35% of the time. That means it's not necessarily, we're having to duplicate energy inputs into our grid, because it needs to be able to meet the maximum demand for the coldest hour of the coldest day in the year, and the hottest hour of the hottest day in the summer. So twice a year, we hit these peaks of demand, and the electricity grid's got to be able to handle that. But the rest of the time, it's not facing that kind of peak. And every 24 hours, I mean, in the middle of the night, there's not that much electricity being used for the obvious reasons. If we could store the stuff that we're producing better, we wouldn't need to have twice as much capacity. Basically, it averages out to all of those different kinds of electricity going into the grid average out to about 50% productivity, which means we've got twice as much capacity to produce electricity as we need. And that's because we don't have good ways of storing it. Hydrogen is a potential answer to storing it, so that we can make a much more efficient use of our electricity infrastructure. Sorry to be sort of nerdy about that, but it is kind of technical.
That's very helpful, and it may be obvious, but let's just state it. The reason why hydrogen is also very attractive, obviously for all the reasons that you mentioned, is because there's no carbon in hydrogen, and so therefore you're not emitting any greenhouse gases when you burn it.
That's right.
I asked you specifically about Alberta and the oil sands because some people think that one of the most efficient ways to create hydrogen is actually from hydrocarbons, and the most efficient way to capture carbon is at source. And so therefore, at source, if we could, number one, convert the hydrocarbons that we're taking out of the ground into hydrogen, and number two, take the carbon and put it back into the ground and capture it and store it, and then frankly, number three, ship something, whether it be in tanker or in pipeline or whatnot, that doesn't have any carbon in it, and so therefore is less of an issue from a leakage standpoint. We've really found the holy grail. What do you think of that?
I'm aligned with that. The oils, with one slight difference, but it's kind of important. You're describing blue hydrogen that's made from natural gas, essentially. It does have some efficiency. It's not zero emission. It's much lower than other forms of energy, much lower than oil or gas, but it's not the zero emissions that you get from green hydrogen produced simply from electrolysis and water. But if you start with natural gas as the way to make methane, really, which is the largest component of natural gas, if you start with that as the way to make hydrogen, it's the most efficient. You use the phrase most efficient. It's the least expensive. That's true. It doesn't get you to zero emissions, but we're not, and this is why it's so important that we understand the policy framework we've got as a country. We're not trying to get to zero in 2030. We're trying to get to net zero in 2050. 30 years is a planning framework that works for capital markets. It works for life cycles of energy infrastructure and so on. And so we need pathways that get us down a slope from where we are now, which is about 700 million tons of GHG emissions a year, to literally net zero in 2050. And so there's lots of room for transitional fuels like natural gas, which is relatively clean, and hydrogen, blue hydrogen made from natural gas during the next 20 or 30 years. And during that period of time, what we're going to discover, we already know, we talk about it all the time. The oil and gas industry talks about it all the time. All the things we use oil for that are not simply for lubricating things or burning, things like the plastic in your cell phone, things like the carbon fiber, materials we're building aircraft out of and racing cars. These are high value uses of hydrocarbons that are not used in a way that releases the carbon into the environment. So we're going to find, first of all, that the demand, even in a world that's moving towards net zero over 30 years, we're going to find a demand for oil and gas pretty strong for quite a long time, through that period of time, through all of that period of time. Whether it doubles again over the next 20 or 30 years, I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're, particularly in the developed world, we've got a sort of maturing of the demand for oil and gas for burning. But for using for other purposes, we'll probably expand those markets as people look for other things to use that resource for. And we'll probably be producing in Canada. We produce 4.5 million tons we export 4.5 million barrels of oil a year from Canada. I expect that if we have this conversation 30 years from now, Brian, let's make an appointment to do that.
I hope we can, Rick. I hope we can.
We'll probably be exporting 4.5 million barrels a day to the United States 30 years from now. But there'll probably be less than half as many emissions associated with those barrels as there are today, and they'll be on their way to net zero by 2050. That doesn't mean net zero exports. That means net zero emissions associated with those exports. And that's why hydrogen, carbon capture, nuclear power is a form of electrifying oil and gas production, blending fuels into petroleum products. Those are all important pieces to this puzzle.
Fascinating conversation, Rick Anderson, Earnscliffe. Thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed the conversation. Enjoy the upcoming conference on the environment.
Well, let's touch base sometime after that. Brian, it's great talking to you as always.
I'd love to. I really would love to. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Good night.